Why are there days when your mind performs at its peak and others when everything becomes heavy and confusing? Why is it that the more you try, the less you advance? Why does your brain seem to fail you just when you need it most? And there is something even more unsettling. What if the problem wasn't your discipline, but the way your nervous system is being pushed to the limit? Stay, because understanding this completely changes the way you work and think. To understand why your mind works so irregularly, you first have to dismantle a widespread idea: the belief that mental performance depends solely on willpower. For years, you've been told that if you concentrate more, if you try harder, if you're more disciplined, everything should flow. But the reality is much more uncomfortable. Your brain doesn't work like a machine that responds obediently to orders. It works like a biological system, deeply sensitive to the environment, to pressure, and above all, to the type of demands it receives. On days when you perform well, it's not that you're smarter or more motivated. It's that your nervous system is in a state of balance. Information enters, is processed, and leaves without friction. There is no internal alarm, no feeling of constant threat. In contrast, on days when everything becomes an uphill battle, that balance is broken. The brain stops prioritizing deep thinking and starts concentrating on surviving the excess of stimuli. Here, the first key point of the original content appears. Not all tasks are equally draining. A repetitive job is not the same as one that requires constant decision-making, anticipating errors, interpreting ambiguous signals, or managing emotional conflicts. This second type of work consumes an enormous amount of cognitive energy, even if from the outside it seems like you're not doing anything physically demanding. The problem is that this invisible wear and tear is rarely recognized. You keep demanding the same level of performance from yourself, even when your brain is already saturated. Every notification, every interruption, every small additional pressure accumulates. It doesn't feel like a major immediate collapse, but like a slow erosion. You start making silly mistakes, rereading the same sentence several times, and feeling irritation for no clear reason. And here a crucial question arises. Why do some people seem to handle this load better than others? The answer doesn't lie in talent or intelligence, but in how each nervous system reacts to sustained stress. Some minds detect overload earlier. Others ignore it until it's already too late. This is the exact point where many go wrong. Instead of reducing the pressure, they try to compensate with more effort. But pushing a saturated system doesn't make it perform better. It only accelerates its deterioration. Understanding this is the first step to stop fighting against your own brain and start working with it, not against it. When the nervous system enters overload, the brain changes priority without asking permission. It stops focusing on complex reasoning and moves to a much more primitive mode. It doesn't look for elegant solutions or deep analysis. It seeks to reduce the feeling of threat. That's why in those moments, tasks that previously seemed simple become unbearable. It's not laziness, it's an internal shift in functioning. The original content underlines something essential. The brain interprets certain modern demands as if they were real dangers. Tight deadlines, ambiguous expectations, constant evaluations, and the pressure not to make mistakes activate the same circuits that, in another context, would be used to flee or defend oneself. The body does not distinguish between a physical threat and a sustained psychological threat. To it, prolonged stress is stress without nuance. Here another key phenomenon appears. When this state is maintained for too long, the mind begins to protect itself by closing doors. Creativity is reduced, working memory decreases, and the ability to make decisions becomes erratic. Not because the brain has lost capacity, but because it is rationing resources. It's a survival strategy, not a failure. Many people interpret this phase as a sign that something is wrong with them. They compare themselves with others, reproach themselves for not performing as well as before, and that self-criticism adds an extra layer of pressure. The result is a vicious cycle. The worse you feel about performing less, the more the internal state of alert intensifies. The original text insists that this process is silent. It doesn't arrive all at once. It installs itself little by little, normalizing mental fatigue until you no longer remember what it was like to work with clarity. And the most dangerous thing is that, From the outside, you still seem functional. You deliver, you respond, you move forward, but inside the wear and tear continues. Understanding this dynamic is fundamental because it explains why resting just a little or taking a day off doesn't always solve the problem. It's not just about recovering energy, but about taking the nervous system out of a state of constant defense. And that requires more than just willpower. At this point, the rival channel's content introduces a crucial distinction that almost no one takes into account. Not all mental exhaustion feels the same because not all is born from the same place. There is tiredness from overwork, but there is another much deeper kind that comes from constant hyper-alertness. This second one is the most difficult to identify because it is not always accompanied by obvious physical fatigue. When you live in a prolonged state of mental vigilance, your brain never finishes relaxing. Even in moments of pause, it continues evaluating, anticipating, and reviewing scenarios. This explains why many people say they rest but do not recover. They sleep, they disconnect for a while, but the underlying feeling does not disappear. The nervous system remains on. The original text remarks that this state usually appears in highly responsible, perfectionist people or those used to sustaining many important decisions. It is no coincidence. The greater the need for control and foresight, the greater the invisible load. The problem is not the commitment, but the impossibility of lowering one's guard. Here something paradoxical occurs. The longer this hyperactivation is maintained, the more the capacity to detect internal limit signals is lost. The body warns, but the mind no longer listens. Tension, irritability, and difficulty concentrating are normalized. Everything becomes the new standard. Another key point of the original content is that, in this state, the mind begins to confuse urgency with importance. Everything seems critical. Everything requires immediate attention. This distorted perception keeps the brain trapped in an endless race where there is no space for deep thought or quiet reflection. The most dangerous thing is that this pattern is often reinforced by external recognition. From the outside, it seems that you are performing, that you respond, that you sustain the pressure, but internally the wear and tear continues to grow. And the more time passes, the harder it is to get out because the system has already learned to function in emergency mode. Recognizing this phase is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of intelligence and self-awareness. Because only when you understand what type of exhaustion you are living through, can you begin to change the way you relate to work, to demands, and to yourself. From here, the original content takes an important turn. It explains why many common strategies to be more productive not only do not help, but actually worsen the situation. Infinite to-do lists, aggressive time management techniques, or the obsession with optimizing every minute can be useful for mechanical work. But they are especially harmful when the problem is the saturation of the nervous system. When your brain is already in a state of alert, adding more rigid structure is perceived as additional pressure. Instead of providing clarity, it increases the sensation of being trapped. Each pending task becomes one more threat, each reminder a signal that you are not doing enough. The result is not greater focus, but more internal tension. The original text emphasizes that the brain needs margins, not just order. It needs spaces where it is not required to decide, evaluate, or anticipate. Without those margins, even breaks are lived with guilt. You rest, but with the constant feeling that you should be doing something more productive. Here a central idea appears. True mental recovery does not occur when you stop, but when the brain stops feeling observed and evaluated. As long as that internal pressure to perform exists, even leisure becomes just another task to complete correctly. Many people interpret this difficulty in relaxing as a lack of self-control, but in reality, it is a direct consequence of having spent too much time in high-demand mode. The nervous system has learned that lowering its guard is not safe, and that is why it resists. This point is key to understanding why it is not enough to change superficial habits. It is not about taking more breaks or sleeping a little better, although that helps. It is about modifying the relationship you have with constant demand. Without that change, any technique will only be a temporary patch. In this part, the original content becomes especially clear by pointing out something that usually makes people uncomfortable. Many people confuse resilience with endurance. They believe that being strong means enduring pressure without complaining, continuing to function even though the wear and tear is evident. But the brain does not interpret that resistance as strength, but as a sign that it can continue to be pushed beyond its limits. When you systematically ignore the signals of saturation, the nervous system learns that there will be no relief. And in that absence of a way out, it adopts more drastic defensive strategies. Emotional disconnection, difficulty feeling authentic motivation, and a sense of distance from one's own work appear. It is not real lack of interest, it is self-protection. The original text highlights that this process does not happen overnight. It is built slowly, based on small internal surrenders. You surrender listening to your fatigue, respecting natural rhythms, admitting that something is not working. Each surrender seems minor, but together they create a state of deep disconnection. Here a fundamental point enters. The brain needs clear signals of safety to return to an optimal state of functioning. It is not enough to tell yourself that everything is fine. It needs repeated experiences in which the demand actually decreases, not just in theory. Without those signals, it will continue to operate from a defensive stance. That is why many people feel they have lost the passion for what once mattered to them. Not because they no longer like it, but because their nervous system associates that environment with constant pressure. Recovering mental clarity implies first breaking that association. This is a key moment in the narrative because it shows that the problem is not a lack of capacity or vocation. It is an exhausted system that needs to learn, little by little, that not everything is urgent and that not everything is a threat. In this phase, the rival channel's content introduces a decisive idea. The way out does not consist in doing less out of simple abandonment, but in changing the type of relationship you maintain with demand. The brain does not need to disappear from responsibilities. It needs predictability and clear limits. Without them, it interprets any demand as potentially infinite. When you start establishing real limits, even small ones, the nervous system receives a different signal. Everything is no longer unpredictable. Everything no longer depends on being in permanent alert. And little by little, functions that seemed lost begin to return. Concentration becomes more stable, the mind stops jumping without control, and the sensation of threat diminishes. The original text insists that this process is not immediate. At first, lowering the pace generates discomfort. Guilt appears, as does the fear of not doing enough, and the feeling that something bad is going to happen if you loosen up. This does not mean you are going backward. It means your nervous system is readjusting after a long time in tension. Another key point is that mental clarity does not return all at once, but in layers. First, the constant saturation disappears. Then, the ability to think with more depth returns. And only after that do creativity and the real enjoyment of work return. Attempting to skip these phases is one of the reasons many people relapse. Here something important is revealed. Working well is not working always at the limit. It is knowing when to push and when to let go. The brain performs better when it perceives that an exit exists, that the effort has an end, and that not everything depends on being available all the time. This understanding completely changes the way you interpret your past blocks. You no longer see them as personal failures, but as signs of a system that was asking for an urgent adjustment. The original content closes with an idea that reorganizes all of the above. The mind does not fail without reason. Every block, every drop in performance, every sensation of confusion has been a form of communication. The problem is that for a long time it was interpreted as weakness, when in reality it was a sign of prolonged saturation. When you start looking at your experience from this angle, something changes. You stop asking what is wrong with you and start asking what is happening to you. What kind of demands you are sustaining, what level of pressure you have normalized, and what price you have paid for staying always available. This look does not seek culprits, it seeks understanding. The original text insists that recovering mental balance does not mean giving up ambition or commitment. It means learning to distribute them sustainably. A regulated nervous system is not a passive one. It is one that knows how to enter and exit effort without getting trapped in it. Here the most important closure appears. When you respect internal limits, performance stops being a constant struggle, working feels fluid again, the mind recovers clarity, and decisions stop weighing like they did before. Not because everything is easier, but because the brain is no longer fighting against itself. Understanding this gives you back something essential: confidence in your own ability. Not as a permanent demand, but as a resource that you can use without destroying yourself in the process. And from there, work, creativity, and concentration stop being a daily battle and once again become something you can sustain over time.